goals and objectives that we have, we accomplish those in a straight line. But in an imperfect world, we know that's not the case. And I think everyone would agree with me that the last year has definitely been imperfect. And so today, Dr. Joey Von Nessen is going to share some information with us that's going to help us to understand how to make better business decisions. It's going to help us to create the perfect world that we're all looking for. It's going to help us to stay minutes ahead of the market and essentially helping us remain profitable. Again, good morning. My name is Alan Brown, and I am the Midlands Coordinator and Lead Business Consultant for the Columbia Area Office of the Small Business Development Center. My primary goal is to assist entrepreneurs and business owners in leveraging the tools that are available and aiding them in accomplishing and reaching financial freedom. Today, Dr. Joey Von Nessen, who is a research economist within the Division of Research at the Moore School of Business, within the context of the past year, will give us an update of South Carolina's economy, connecting the dots between the economy and your business, making economics actionable. But before I turn the webinar over to him, let me take a minute or so to briefly describe the South Carolina Small Business Development Center and the work that we do. For over 40 years, the South Carolina Small Business Development Center has served as an economic engine for entrepreneurship across the state. And we do that through 4 regions: the Clemson region, the Winthrop region, the South Carolina State region, and of course, the University of South Carolina region, my alma mater. We have 24 centers in the 46 counties. And again, we've been here for over 40 years. You know, we measure our performance through 5 objectives. And those 5 objectives are new business starts, sales, jobs created and retained, capital funding or financing obtained, and government contracts. And for the year 2019, as you can see on the screen, I think we did a pretty good job in all 5 areas. Not to mention that we served close to 6,000 clients. So for today's purpose, that's all I'm going to share with you. But at the end of today's session, we're going to share some webinars that are coming up in the month of May. Enjoy today's session, and I'll talk to you again at the end of today's session. Dr. Von Nessen is in your hands.
All right, well, that sounds great. Well, thank you very much, Alan, and many thanks to everyone for being here today to participate in this webinar. It's a pleasure to be with all of you again to talk about the economic landscape of what's happening in South Carolina. Again, my name is Joey Von Nessen. I am a research economist in the Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. And I always like to describe what we do as so what economics. I use that term a lot. And I use it because it is very descriptive. It's you know, I say it half joking, but to make a serious point that we are always looking at economic data and asking that basic question: so what? How do these data matter? Why do they matter? And how can we use economic data to make better strategic decisions? That's really what we're all about and what we're trying to do on a regular basis. And when you're looking to make strategic decisions, as Alan has already alluded to, you have to first understand the economic landscape, the market environment that you find yourself in. And so that's really what we're going to be looking at today, talking about where South Carolina sits today in April of 2021. We'll talk about what's happened as the economy, of course, has been turned upside down over the last year. We'll talk about some of the trends that have changed in South Carolina, where we are today, and where we're likely headed into the summer months for the rest of this year and even into thinking about 2022. If we can all believe that we even are thinking in terms of 2022 already, it's hard to believe that we're already in April. So with that, let's go ahead and get started and talk about what's been happening. And if we look at the data in South Carolina in terms of what we've seen over the last year, one of the things that we found is that South Carolina has actually recovered fairly well in the second half of 2020 after the mandated government shutdown was followed by the reopening of the economy, which we saw throughout 2020. And by many measures, we are almost back in South Carolina, getting closer to full recovery. And there are ways that we can see this very clearly and track the recovery that has occurred throughout 2020. The first way to do this is to look at basic employment patterns that we've seen in South Carolina over the last year. So this tracks employment going back to January of 2020. And you can see three distinct phases of South Carolina's economic contraction and recovery during 2020. The first, of course, is the contraction period that I can highlight here that occurred between February and April of 2020, where we saw the mandated government shutdown, and which translated into a loss of about 13.5% in terms of total employment in South Carolina. Now, what does that mean in terms of sheer jobs? It's about 308,000 jobs in South Carolina that were lost between February and April of 2020, about close to 14% of our workforce. Again, a sizable contraction there. Again, everybody is aware of this level, at least in general, but we can really see this when we put some numbers on it in terms of how intense it really was. And then that was then followed immediately by what economists call a V-shaped recovery pattern. The V meaning the contraction, the sharp contraction, followed by a sharp recovery, which occurred basically in the mid to late spring of 2020 from about April till July. And then that V-shaped recovery pattern was then followed by what economists call a U-shaped recovery pattern, which you can see here that I can highlight. The U being a slow and steady recovery, where we see much softer rates or slower rates of growth, but fairly consistent over time. And that's basically the recovery pattern that we have been in since essentially early to mid July of 2020. And you can see that it's been fairly consistent since then, throughout 2020 and into early 2021. So when we aggregate these numbers up, then what does that mean for total economic recovery in South Carolina in terms of what we've seen overall? Well, when we put all this together, we see that we're within today about 4% of the employment levels that we were at pre-COVID in February of 2020, which is a pretty solid recovery. We have done well relative to most other states. We're in the upper half of the distribution when you look at the United States as a whole. And generally speaking, we've recovered faster than Georgia and North Carolina, our border states. So overall, South Carolina has actually done a fairly good job in terms of the recovery that we've seen. It's been a fairly strong recovery pattern. However, having said that, there is a big caveat, which is that the recovery in South Carolina has been very dichotomous. And we can see that very clearly in this slide here. And I would suggest to you that this is the single best illustration or graphic that you will see that describes the current state of South Carolina's economy. So on the right side of your screen, you can see the recovery that we have experienced in South Carolina to date when we look at all sectors in the state except for leisure and hospitality. So just for the moment, let's put leisure and hospitality and the service sector aside and just focus on everything else. And when we do that, and we look at the recovery that South Carolina has seen, we're basically within about 2 to 2.5% in terms of the employment levels that we were at back in February of 2020, right? So we're within 2.5%. So again, that means that overall industry sectors are looking pretty strong. They have in the aggregate almost fully recovered. And in some cases, they have fully recovered. However, if we look at leisure and hospitality by itself, you see a very, very different story. Leisure and hospitality still down about 14%, 13.8% you see is measured here, compared to employment levels of February of 2020. So a very, very different picture depending on whether we're looking at the service sector as embodied by leisure and hospitality, or we're looking at all other sectors. And what does that mean for South Carolina? It basically means that in 2021, when we talk about recovery for our state, really what we mean is recovery of the leisure and hospitality sector. That's the sector that's still really hurting, and that's the sector that still has to recover, because most other industry sectors are either recovered or mostly recovered when we analyze them on an individual basis. So a very dichotomous recovery that we're seeing, but you can also see here what it really means for South Carolina to recover as we move into the summer months. Now, we can also look at South Carolina from a regional perspective, looking at unemployment trends over time, over the past year. And you can see how the unemployment patterns have progressed over time in a similar way that we've seen employment levels overall progress over time. So first of all, just take a quick look at the map on the left and the right-hand side of your screen in February of 2020 and February of 2021. And the counties in blue represent the highest unemployment rates in South Carolina, the 23 counties that have the highest unemployment rates. South Carolina, of course, has 46 counties, so those are the 50% or the half of South Carolina with the highest unemployment. Now notice that the distribution of these unemployment rates are very similar when we look at February of 2020 versus February of 2021. So if you had been in South Carolina in February of 2020, and let's say you had left the earth for some reason and you came back a year later and we're just looking at these unemployment patterns, not a major difference here in terms of the distribution. So again, they look very similar. But we do see a major deviation in April of 2020. You see where unemployment peaked in South Carolina at 11.5%. And I can just highlight here the areas of South Carolina that saw a significant increase in unemployment trends. And these are correlated very highly with, as you would expect, the industries that experienced the highest unemployment. Leisure and hospitality was number one. That's the industry, of course, that's still hurting that we talked about. Manufacturing was the second hardest hit. And then healthcare was actually the third hardest hit, the healthcare related services. So that was due to the fact that many non-emergency related healthcare needs, as well as non-emergency surgeries, were postponed. So that's everything from regular doctor's visits to dental care to physical therapy, the types of appointments and healthcare needs that are important but are not urgent and can be postponed by a number of weeks or potentially a number of months. So when we look at those, you can see in this map in the center of your screen, significant rises in unemployment in coastal South Carolina, as well as the upstate. So the upstate primarily the result from manufacturing shutdowns in the early part of the summer of 2020. Manufacturing shuts down. It then begins to reopen in the summer months, and we see unemployment come back down. Leisure and hospitality to a lesser extent, of course, because it is still hurting overall when we look at the industry as a whole. So you can see that progression in South Carolina and the areas that were hit hardest based on the industries that were hit the hardest. Now, unemployment rates for South Carolina, again, looking at the track of what we've seen throughout the previous year, going back to January of 2020. Unemployment, as I mentioned, peaked at 11.5% back in April of 2020. And you can see that it's dropped down to now close to 5%, which is really close to full employment by some measures that economists use, meaning that more and more of the unemployment that we're seeing is not a result of a lack of job availability. That's basically what full employment means. Not zero unemployment, but unemployment in which the primary cause of the unemployment is not simply because the economy is doing so poorly that there are very little jobs available. So that's very good news that we're seeing that recovery. And of course, coming off of an unemployment rate in January of 2020 of 2.6%, which was historically low in South Carolina. That's the lowest on record for unemployment in our state for our history. So the U.S. economy and South Carolina's economy actually was in very good shape heading into the pandemic, into January and February of 2020. Okay, so let's change gears then a little bit, and let's talk a bit more about the macro economy, the U.S. economy as a whole. Because just as we see this dichotomous economic recovery that has emerged over the last year, the goods versus the services market, or leisure and hospitality in South Carolina versus all other sectors, we see the same pattern emerging, or that has emerged at the national level as well. And we can look at this especially by examining consumer spending patterns at the national level. And consumer spending is a very, very important economic metric that we need to be monitoring, because this represents about 70% of the US economy, 70% of US GDP. So it's the bulk of economic activity in our economy. And so it's important to understand these patterns and what is driving these spending patterns. And here you can see the representation of all goods and services. This tracks it back over the past decade, going back to 2010. And you'll notice here that the increase in spend over time is pretty consistent. If we were to fit a trend line or a regression line along this graph, you get a pretty tight fit, right? Not a whole lot of deviation around the long run trend there. Of course, everything changes in 2020. You see the major contraction in consumer spending and the recovery that we've seen since then. Not all the way back to the levels of spending we were at before the pandemic, but a sizable recovery nonetheless. But as with the data in South Carolina, it's very, very different. You get a very different picture depending on whether we focus just on goods or whether we focus just on services. So let's break down each one of those and look at those in a little bit more detail. So first of all, let's look at durable goods spending. And here you can very clearly see a major uptick in consumer spending in 2020 and into 2021. And this is one of the dominant trends that's driving our economic recovery right now, and that's creating a lot of the challenges that we see across the board, particularly when you think about all the supply chain constraints that many businesses are having right now, especially in manufacturing, in housing, and in other sectors. So durable goods is, this is a pattern that we need to monitor very carefully. Again, you see a very similar historical pattern of growth over time, going back to January of 2010, the drop off in early 2020 during the mandatory government shutdown, and then that elevated level of spending that has occurred since then. And there are two primary factors that we can look at as driving this change in the historical patterns, right? The reason that we're seeing a significant elevation in consumer spending above what we would expect given the historical patterns. And it comes down to two specific effects: the income effect and the substitution effect. The substitution effect is simply the result of the fact that consumers in 2020 were staying home, and because they didn't have any services they could spend on, right? They weren't going out to eat, they weren't traveling. What did they do? Well, they shifted their spending and they spent more in the goods market rather than services. So they simply substituted away from spending on services and substituted towards spending on goods, and durable goods in particular. So that was a big piece of what we were seeing here.
So Dr. Von Nessen.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So when you say durable goods, and I'm thinking about what was happening last year, is that when all of a sudden we saw, people in the communities riding bicycles, we saw people in the community, building decks and gardening? Is that what you mean when you talk about durable goods?
That's exactly right. So durable goods are everything from housing. Housing goods is a big one. Bicycles, exercise bikes in particular. People quit going to the gym. We saw an uptick in exercise equipment. Vehicles has seen an increase in demand recently. Things like dishwashers, home appliances more generally. So yes, all those types of goods, that's exactly right, because people were staying home and they weren't spending on services, and so they were doing more home repairs. That was a large part of this. Yes.
Thank you.
So that substitution effect, exactly what is being described there, and that occurred throughout 2020 and is still happening. The other effect, though, that's not the whole story, is the income effect. So we have the income and the substitution effect. The income effect, basically being the result of the fact that disposable income among Americans was significantly up throughout 2020, largely because of the stimulus packages that were passed. And so we saw this manifest itself in a variety of ways through unemployment benefits and stimulus checks and other measures that we can see. But overall income levels were up, disposable income levels were up. And so as a result, when you see incomes rise, consumers tend to spend more on all goods, and including durable goods. So when you put those together, you see the significant increase in spending. And one of the questions that we're going to come back and talk about later, looking forward, is how long is this durable spending or this durable goods bubble, as we might call it, how long is that going to last? Now we can contrast this with non-durable goods, the other type of goods market in the United States. Now, non-durables has not seen much of an increase over historical trends. So this is more what we might expect, following the decline in 2020 during the shutdown during the spring. You see a resumption of a more normal growth patterns, more in line with historical trends. And that's basically just because of the nature of the goods that are contained within these definitions. So non-durables are things like food and dishwashing liquid and paper products, things that you typically don't see people spending more or less on just because they see a slight increase or decrease in their incomes, or especially an increase. So for example, you typically don't buy more dishwashing liquid just because you get a bonus at work or your income goes up for some reason. So non-durable and durable goods, just very different categories. And that's why we see more of a resumption of normal spending patterns here, but not that elevated level of activity.
So
Now,
can I ask you a question? Because I don't use the term non-durable goods on a day-to-day basis. So I'm trying to connect this, for the term that I may use with my clients or business owners might use. Is consumables a good substitution for the word non-durable goods?
I think that would work. Yes, that would get the that has the same general meaning. Here we're just non-durable goods is more of a formalized definition for contrasting that to durable goods. But yes, consumables, things that are consumed relatively quickly. Yes, that is very much in line with non-durables. Same sentiment there, and same types of goods being described.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So non-durable goods and durable goods, basically seeing these levels of spending come back has been very, very positive, and especially for a state like South Carolina, whereas we all know much of our economic activity is dependent upon export-oriented manufacturing. And so specifically, we've seen very strong recovery for the Charleston port since basically last summer. So here, we can just look at cumulative changes since January of 2020. And you can look at export activity and import activity. And regardless, we've seen a decline during the spring and summer months, followed by a very sizable recovery. And in March of 2021, last month, the Charleston port actually reported they had their highest level of container volume shipments in their history, highest volume in their history. So why is that happening? Well, it goes back to those elevated levels of durable goods spending, because those goods have to be shipped. And when they're coming into South Carolina, or they're flowing out of South Carolina because they're being produced in South Carolina by our manufacturers, the port is accommodating all of that cargo traffic, or well, not all of it, but a bulk of it. And so that's certainly boosting their demand as a whole. So that's benefiting the port, that's benefiting manufacturing in South Carolina. And so both of those are very positive for our state, because that leads to a faster recovery and more economic activity. Seeing the port do more business and seeing our manufacturers doing more business, again, very, very positive as we continue to recover. And then a very different picture when we look at consumer spending for services. So this is the same graph, again, same time period, but this time we're looking at services. And you see it looks just completely the opposite, right, from durable goods spending. So whereas we have that elevated level of spending for durable goods, we have a significant reduction in spending for services, very comparable to what we saw when we looked at that graph back in South Carolina of the decline in leisure and hospitality in terms of employment levels. So we see a significant decline in services during the spring of 2020. We do see some recovery. So in fact, we've seen significant recovery in spending on services, but not nearly to the level that we were at before COVID. So this, again, from a national perspective, when we talk about recovery, spending on services and the service industries is really what we mean when we talk about economic recovery at this point for not only South Carolina's economy, but for the national economy as well. Okay, so let's change gears then a little bit and talk more about where we are going forward. We've talked a lot about the last year. We've talked a lot about some of the industry trends that we have observed and some of the more real-time metrics that we can be monitoring that are explaining some of the patterns that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis, especially when we start looking at supply chain constraints with respect to manufactured goods. And we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that in housing markets here in just a moment. But let's change gears a little bit now and start looking ahead to the summer in terms of what we can expect for the rest of 2021. And I've kind of given away the punchline here that there is some light at the end of the tunnel. So we are very optimistic about the second half of 2021. Certainly far more optimistic than we were last summer, because there have just been so many unknowns here. This has been a period where I like to say biology has been the driving force behind this economic recovery and the pace of it more so than economics. It's been the biological factors, mainly getting the vaccine developed and rolled out, not so much the economic factors. So follow the biology, follow the vaccine rollout, and that's where we see, that's where we can really get our best insight into the pace of the recovery. So having said that, as we see the vaccine rolled out, we see that continuing to make progress. That bodes very well as we head into the summer months. And I would suggest to you that we've got really biological and economic booster shots for our society right now. And we can look at that in a couple of different ways. We see the vaccine, which was recently made available for all adults for South Carolina, certainly as of March 31st. And so as that begins to be rolled out faster and faster, that's going to help increase and improve consumer confidence. And that's really the key. That's the underlying variable that we need to be watching for the service sector, because as we see the vaccine rolled out, as we see consumers become more confident, they then will be more likely to go out and book travel, go out and go to restaurants or go to movie theaters and do all of the more normal spending patterns that get closer to mirroring what we saw before the pandemic began. So consumer confidence going up is going to be key. It is starting to rise. We've seen consumer confidence bounce back from its low levels from last summer. Still not to levels that we were at before the pandemic, but we're beginning to move in a positive direction there. We also see anecdotal information coming in suggesting that the older population, which has now had a period of time where they have been vaccinated and have been getting vaccinated, so they're kind of on the front end of the rollout, we're seeing that the older population is beginning to actually spend on services. They're booking trips. They are going out to eat. They're making hotel reservations. So again, we don't have a lot of data on that yet, but we are seeing some anecdotal information come in that suggests that people are willing to and are wanting to get out and spend on the service sector because they're ready. There's a pent-up demand for travel and for social interaction that is going to be realized as the vaccine continues to be rolled out. So I think we can anticipate more and more movement in that direction as we head into the summer months. And then secondly, we're also seeing we're beginning to see the effects of the fiscal stimulus package, the $1.9 trillion package, as well as the $900 billion package that was passed back in December, both of which are, at least in part, designed to serve as a bridge from where we are today until we get to full recovery. So that's introducing additional demand into the national economy, which is going to continue to boost economic growth. Now, we're going to come back and talk in a moment about some concerns about inflation, and I'll speak to what we might expect later this year and what we need to be on the lookout for. But let's hold off on that discussion for just a moment. And as we look at South Carolina, getting back to looking at recovery for the rest of this year and what that means, full recovery in South Carolina, we can define that. One way to define that is, when do we recover all of the jobs that we lost? Remember, I mentioned before that we lost about 308,000 jobs, about 14% of the workforce in South Carolina between February and April of 2020. And so again, one way to think about recovery is, when do we recover all of those jobs that were lost? And so we can look at a number of different scenarios based on historical growth patterns so far, and based on what we know about the vaccine rollout and what the anticipated rollout is likely to be in the coming months. And so we have here an optimistic and a pessimistic projection, or what I would call an upper and a lower bound on possible recovery scenarios for South Carolina. And the bottom line is that we're basically looking at full recovery in South Carolina sometime between the third quarter in 2021 and the second quarter in 2022. As we move ahead, I'm more and more optimistic that the green line is more likely. That is, we're more likely to see full recovery sometime in 2021 than in 2022. We don't think it will be before the third quarter, but we are increasingly optimistic that we're going to be closer to this optimistic projection than to the pessimistic projection. But regardless, we're seeing employment recovery and recovery in South Carolina coming along nicely. And this summer is going to be key to really assessing whether we're likely to be on the upper or lower bound here. I think the ideal scenario for South Carolina is one in which we see the vaccine continue to roll out and disseminated to South Carolinians, and we hit a critical mass for the number of people who receive that vaccine as we're getting into tourism season. So let's say by either before or around Memorial Day, if those two factors come together at the same time, then we could see a very, very strong tourism season for South Carolina. So that's going to be important to watch. But that I would suggest to you is the best case scenario for South Carolina at this point.
So Dr. Von Nessen.
Yeah, go ahead.
Why are you so optimistic?
Because the recovery patterns that we're seeing so far, we're beginning to see spending anecdotally among the populations that have already received the vaccine. And we are seeing more and more demand in general in coastal markets. And if we look at leisure and hospitality, they're already beginning to ramp up. Again, we don't have a lot of specific, it hasn't been long enough to really get the numbers in yet, but the anecdotal data are looking very positive. And based on the projections of the vaccine rollout, it's looking more and more like we're going to get closer and closer to those pre-pandemic norms where people are going out and spending in the service sector, and we're beginning to see consumer confidence come back. So all of that is still in its early stages, but unless we see a major shock, like a new COVID variant that is, let's say, vaccine resistant, I think that could definitely put a dent in these recovery projections. But barring that, again, the data are looking pretty strong.
Okay. So basically what I hear you saying, and I'm gonna be, basically what I hear you saying is, Alan, what I told you in the previous two sessions is happening, right? People are taking, people are getting the vaccination, children are going back to school, parents are getting their sanity back, and so they're going out and spending the stimulus money that they've gotten, and some of the money they've been saving over time, and we see that happening more and more.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. And just with the one caveat, of course, that we're not out of the woods yet. So we still have a ways to go, and businesses in the service sector, many of them are still really struggling, but now they're struggling more to find workers than they are to find customers. which is a different challenge.
Yeah, that is a different challenge. A lot of our customers, our clients that we deal with, saying that's one of the major issues they're having in the recovery process is finding the workers to fill the jobs.
Yes, and there are several reasons for that. Right now, we're seeing, first of all, we still have individuals that are reluctant to come back into the workforce, especially if they haven't been vaccinated. Secondly, particularly in the service sector, we're seeing unemployment benefits and extended unemployment benefits that are providing income to individuals that are either at or close to, or in some case higher than what they would be earning in the labor market, especially when you combine unemployment benefits with the stimulus checks. And so that makes it much harder for businesses, particularly in the service sector, where the average wage tends to be lower relative to the state average, where those two are rivaling one another. And so it just makes it harder for businesses to compete with that. Now, those additional benefits will eventually run out. But in the meantime, it makes it very hard for employers to attract workers. And in coastal South Carolina, they're also being faced with the challenge of less students, fewer students, because there were some immigration restrictions last year preventing students from coming in and to our universities because of COVID, and trying to limit movement across countries. But that had the effect of limiting the number of international students coming to South Carolina. And many businesses, especially in the leisure and hospitality sector, relied on those students as part-time workers. So they're getting hit from multiple angles and are really struggling now to find the employees that they need amidst a period of surging demand that we're seeing as more and more people are vaccinated and that demand is ramping up. So, and I think that's going to be a challenge for the foreseeable future until I think the first change we might see is when those extended unemployment benefits run out, and then we begin to see that difference between the income sources will perhaps change incentives there. But that's the reality of what many businesses are facing right now, particularly in the service sector.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's change gears a little bit and talk about housing trends. Another important element that I think is important to address, because the housing market right now, as you all know, is just going crazy, right? That's an official term, right? A technical term. But we're seeing housing prices that have just increased dramatically in the last year. Three primary reasons for this. Number one, we've seen a record increase in demand. Record sales activity. This has been true in South Carolina, especially in the coastal region. So I'll pick on Charleston for a couple of illustrations that I want to share with you. But coastal South Carolina more generally, but record sales activity, and we're seeing it throughout the state, in Columbia and Greenville. It's not just the coastal markets, but that's where it is most intense. We're also seeing significant rising material costs. This is especially true for lumber prices, which have just skyrocketed in recent months. And then extremely tight housing supply has also led to price increases, because we were at relatively low inventory levels before the pandemic. And then when the pandemic hit and fewer people within South Carolina were moving, people were staying home more, that made that housing, that exacerbated the limitations on the supply that we were seeing. And all three of these together generated record price increases, which is what we observed over the last year. And again, I said I would pick on Charleston a little bit here to show you some illustrations of what's going on. But in the past 4 years or so, up through 2020, you can see that the median annual house price growth in Charleston was about 5% per year. And that had been, as you see here, very, very stable. A lot of fluctuations month to month, but in general, over the long haul, we see about 5% annual house price growth. So not too much of a fluctuation there. And then 2020 hits, and we've seen 16% annual growth in the last year. And this is through the early spring months. We've seen the data actually show that this is intensifying even further. But you can see here growth over 3 times the rate that we've seen in previous years. So going from 5% per year to about 16% per year. So, and Charleston's not the only market, of course, but it's one that I wanted to illustrate to you just to give you an example of what these price increases really mean from a practical perspective. Now, why is this the case? 4 primary reasons in terms of what we've seen throughout 2020. Number 1 is that there were very few employment losses, it turns out, among potential home buyers. And in general, the best single predictor that we have for housing demand is employment growth, because you can't buy a house if you don't have a job. And so employment trends are very important to monitor. And what we saw in the last year was that when we looked at the unemployment levels in South Carolina and across the US more generally to a large extent, which sectors saw the highest levels of unemployment? It was the leisure and hospitality sector, as we just looked at. And that sector tends to employ relatively lower wage workers who are much more likely to be renters or in the rental market or rental customers as opposed to potential home buyers. And so that's why we saw very high housing demand in the face of very high unemployment, because in this previous recession, it was unique for, among other reasons, because the employment was largely concentrated within among lower wage jobs, which didn't have a dramatic effect on the housing market. So that's one reason, that underlying employment-based demand was really maintained. Secondly, we see that migration patterns in general strongly favor South Carolina. This has been true for a number of years. South Carolina has benefited from retirees and the aging of the baby boomers coming into the state, especially along the coast, because we have a lot of natural amenities, we have a low cost of living, and that's very attractive. We have a high quality of life, and so that's attracted people from around the US and internationally for years. But in the pandemic, it also has meant, as the work from home phenomenon has become more normalized in professional circles, it means that as people have been looking to leave major urban areas, most notably New York and San Francisco, among others, that they've had an opportunity to live wherever they want because they're not tied to their employer's geography any longer. And so the Southeast has benefited from that, and South Carolina has benefited from that as well. I talk to builders frequently who have said that they've seen an uptick in the number of out-of-state buyers in the last 12 months. So that's been a part of it as well. And then finally, simple measures of income and costs have, of course, affected this as well. More disposable income, higher savings rates, we've talked about that and why that has occurred. And then low mortgage interest rates in the past year. So both of those have combined to provide more resources and lower costs for potential home buyers. So you put all this together and you have really basically the perfect combination for a very strong housing market in 2020 and into 2021. And I'll just briefly illustrate this, again, picking on Charleston again one more time, but just comparing employment trends. I want to go back and focus on this one where we see fewer employment losses among potential home buyers. So you see if you look at all other sectors in blue and the leisure and hospitality sector in red, and just look at the employment growth trends over time, January to November of 2020, again, just look at that huge difference there between the losses in jobs that were experienced, depending on the sector that you look at. And then we can focus there on, again, this is just 2020 data going through 2020, a 26% decline in leisure and hospitality last year over 2019, compared to about 2% for the state. And look at the difference in the median annual wages and the estimated maximum house price affordability based on those jobs. If you assume a dual income household and what you can afford in terms of a mortgage. And also notice how closely these two numbers line up. These are and hopefully you can see my screen here, or my mouse, but this graph on the bottom of your screen illustrates the median house price in Charleston for December 2018, 19, and 20. And just notice how closely these line up right here, right, within a few $1,000s. So what this tells us, again, is that the potential home buyers and the customers in this market, in Charleston's market, are largely among this all other sector or industry sector, not necessarily in leisure and hospitality. So we've seen relatively high unemployment coupled with strong housing demand as a result. Again, I use Charleston as the example because it's a more extreme case, but this has been happening in markets across South Carolina and to some extent across the US as well. All right, a couple of other comments on housing. What will happen with this, with the housing bubble? Is the bubble going to burst? And what are the demand drivers that we need to be looking out for? The short answer is that I don't think the bubble is going to burst. We may see some movement back towards equilibrium, where we see lower overall demand and we see lower growth in housing prices. But this is a very different market environment than we were in 2008. It's not based on speculation, at least not at this time. So while we can expect some changes, I think the idea that we're in this huge bubble that's just going to completely collapse, like we saw in 2008 with the housing market, that's really not where we're at right now. And just a couple of quick points to make about this. If we look at demand drivers going forward, in the lower price points, basically you need to be looking out for the tug of war between rising mortgage interest rates and rising employment growth this year. So as we see more employment recovery among lower wage jobs, that still on the margin creates more demand for housing for first-time home buyers. But that is also offset by rising mortgage interest rates, which makes housing more expensive. So this tug of war between these two factors, an important factor to watch for the demand, whether it's going to go up or down for entry-level housing. And then for the higher price points, we see a similar economic tug of war between spending on services and spending on goods, which of course housing is a durable good. So if we see more of a shift back towards spending on services and away from spending on goods, then that means that we may see a marginal decline or a small decline in housing demand overall. So this is another important set of metrics to watch. What are the consumer spending patterns? Do they shift or do they not shift? And how quickly do they shift? That's going to influence what we're likely to see in housing markets as well as we move ahead. And then finally, as we wrap up, just a couple of quick comments on inflation. Another important component of what we're looking at this year in terms of our outlook, and the basic question being, will the economy overheat? What are we likely to see going forward? And starting out, it's important to talk about why this is an important question to worry about. Why is inflation a problem at all? And the answer is that while we do want to see some inflation, because inflation means that we are experiencing a growing economy. So inflation is not bad. Inflation is not bad. It's excessive inflation that's a problem. Because when inflation gets too high, that begins to erode purchasing power on the part of consumers. And that's really where it becomes a problem. And when we talk about our economy overheating, that's really what we mean. So the challenge is that we want to see some level of inflation, but not excessive inflation. It's a delicate balancing act. And so to really get a handle on this, one way we can think about excessive inflation is to compare actual GDP versus potential GDP. Potential GDP is the fastest that we can assume that the US economy can grow over the long run. If we're at full employment, if all capital and labor resources are being employed to their or utilized to their fullest and maximum extent, that's what potential US GDP is. And we can compare potential US GDP to actual GDP, what we're actually experiencing. And that's what you see here in the difference between the red and the green line. And of course, what you would expect is that our actual GDP right now is well below our potential GDP. And in fact, it is. And you can see how it went well below potential back in 2020, particularly during the shutdown. And so part of the reason for economic stimulus is to help to bridge that gap and to get us closer to our potential than we were at right now. And so to give you a feel for the relative size of these stimulus packages, Let's look first at this blue line here. And again, I hope you can see the mouse okay. But this blue line represents the difference between actual and potential GDP. So when the blue line is above 0, it means that our actual GDP is actually above potential. So when we get above 0 is really when we're at the threat for inflation. When it's below 0 here, it means that we are that our potential GDP is much higher than our actual GDP. So start by looking back at 2008. The $700 billion bailout, if you recall, was designed to help to stimulate the economy and, in a sense, make up for some of this gap, right? Get this blue line back up to that 0. So you can just compare the size between the gap here, which was about 900 billion at the time, and the size of the stimulus package. Now, on the flip side, if we look at what's going on today, we can see what this gap is here, which is about 600 to 650 billion. But notice a huge stimulus here when we combine what the stimulus from December with the current stimulus, close to $2.8 trillion, because this represents the fourth quarter of 2020, before that $900 billion was actually passed. And so this is why there's a debate among economists about whether we'll see significant inflation later this year, because if most of these dollars are spent, then that could potentially cause us to overshoot and get us into a larger, getting us to a point where we're overshooting potential GDP, and that's what can potentially lead to more inflation. Now, as I said, there's a debate about this because we have not been in this situation before, but we do expect that if excessive inflation occurs, it's likely to happen in late 2021 or early 2022. That's the time period that we may begin to observe this if it becomes a reality. And the way to see this, the way to monitor it, is to look at core inflation, what economists call core inflation, which basically means inflation minus food and energy prices and commodities more generally, because those tend to be highly volatile. We can just look at all commodities here and just look at this price index where you see, going back to 2007, inflation all over the place, right? When we look at the price index for all commodities. So this is especially volatile during an economic recovery. So it's not going to be that helpful to look at inflation when you include all of these different elements here. So we want to take out food and energy and just focus on this one measure here in brown and not the line in blue. And another example, you can go back to 2010 and see how inflation across all goods actually went up to about 4%, which would be very concerning, except for the fact that this included the food and energy prices as well. If we look at core inflation, notice that never got above about 2%, which is where the Fed target typically is. So I would suggest to you that going forward, if we see core inflation, excluding food and energy, significantly exceed 2% for any length of time, that's the major red flag. That's the warning sign that the Federal Reserve is looking for in order to indicate excessive inflation. And like I said, we don't know if that's going to happen, but if it happens, it's likely to occur later in 2021 during the latter part of the year, or perhaps early 2022. So just finally, wrapping up, a few concluding points here. As we mentioned, the economy has experienced a strong rebound, with most major sectors now approaching pre-recession employment levels, the primary exception being leisure and hospitality, which we expect to continue to recover this summer. That's really going to be the key to full recovery for South Carolina. We anticipate continued strong demand in manufacturing and in the housing sector as well. Though as we see those consumer spending patterns shift back towards services, that may mitigate some of the strong demand that we're seeing right now. So that's an important factor to be watching to assess how long we see these supply chain constraints last, how long we see the strong housing demand that's currently with us. And as I mentioned, full recovery for South Carolina increasingly likely to happen in 2021, but that really depends on the biological factors more than the economic factors. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. And Alan, I'll turn it back over to you, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Von Nessen. Great presentation. Are there any questions? You can type your question in the chat or unmute yourself. Let me see. No questions. Let me see. Make sure I don't see any questions in the chat. All right. So I don't. Oh well, maybe one. So let me figure this out. Oh nope. So I was reminded: do not unmute. Do not unmute. Type your questions in the chat. So Dr. Von Nessen, go back to this the GDP slide when you were talking about potential GDP and actual GDP, if you could.
So let's go back here to potential and actual. Yes, right here.
So at one set, at one slice of the line, actual is higher than potential.
Yes.
So is there some type of compounding effect when things kind of work hand in hand to cause the actual to go higher than your potential? Like how do you do better than you're capable of doing is I guess my question.
Right. No, that's a great question. And basically when you get above potential, that's typically when the economy is, when you have a business that is operating at a capacity that is not sustainable. So if you think about a company that sees a major increase in demand, but it's the type of demand that they can accommodate for a very short period of time with their current resources, but they'd have to expand either their employment or their production capabilities in order to do it for any extended period. So that's really what we're talking about. And so any significant or sustained level of potential over actual that's the type of activity that we're looking at. The other thing is that potential is a hypothetical. It's not necessarily observed. So one of the big debates about about inflation among economists, one of the sources is how reliable are these measures of potential U.S. GDP? Because if you see potential and actual being very, very different, if you see potential as really high, then you're going to be less concerned about inflation than if you see it potential GDP is relatively lower, right? Because we don't need as much stimulus to get back there. I think that most economists agree in general that the level of stimulus is either sufficient or perhaps a bit excessive in terms of getting us back to the potential GDP that as it's currently measured. But again, we just haven't been in this situation before, so we really don't know exactly where that tipping point is, which is why looking out for core inflation is going to be so important. And if you really want to put a fine point on it, the real concern is if you see that core inflation get above 3% for any length of time. That's really the magic number. I hate to use that because there are a number of factors we got to be watching. But if there's just one, if you see core inflation hit 3%, that's a big warning sign for possible future inflationary concerns.
Okay, great. Well, I think our audience is more sophisticated, and I say that because they continue to listen to you and get educated on how to use the different tools and benchmarks that you've shared with us in making better business decisions. There are a couple of questions in the chat that I want to share with you before I ask my next question.
Yeah.
The first is from Damon Taylor. And the question is, he says, hello, how do you feel about restaurant revitalization fund should help the hospitality and leisure industry? So how do you think the restaurant revitalization fund should help the hospitality and leisure industry?
Well, I can say what we have seen success with are you talking about the PPP funds?
Well, so there's a new fund that the SBA just put information out over the last few days, and it's geared specifically towards the restaurant industry, which we are translating as the leisure and hospitality industry. I would also add the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant. Those two programs together, And so I'm going to modify the question slightly to include the shuttered venue operators grant, and just based on what you know about now, right? What the anecdotal data is saying now, with those two programs coming online, how do you think it would help the leisure and hospitality industry?
Well, I think two points to make, I think, about that. First of all, is that the PPP funds originally, which this is modeled off of, were very successful and did help a lot of businesses, particularly in the service sector, survive up until this point. So there were some problems with the programs, to be sure, but they largely did accomplish what they were designed to do, which was to keep these businesses going and to keep the laid off, or to keep workers from being laid off. Right, that was the whole point, is to keep income flowing into people's pockets. So to that extent, they were largely successful. So they have a good track record. But having said that, the problem now is increasingly not a lack of demand. It really is more of a lack of the ability to find workers, and that's really what we're beginning to see. So I think that we need to be looking at more efforts towards helping people get back into the labor force, getting them vaccinated, providing methods to easily transition them back. That's done with the Department of Employment and Workforce and other initiatives to help move them back into the labor force. But that's going to be the challenge this summer. It's not so much going to be a demand problem, and the PPP money was largely addressing a demand challenge. Now it's more about a labor supply challenge. That's really where we're headed going forward. So I think the programs to maximize their effectiveness for businesses now, that's really going to be the challenge they're going to have to tackle.
Okay. So another question, Rosalind Goodwin says, you spoke a lot about the challenges of the leisure and hospitality industry. Which service-based businesses are showing strengths and gains?
So really all are beginning to. We're seeing uptick in restaurants and hotels. We're seeing more anecdotal evidence of things like salons and barber shops and bowling alleys. Basically, the service industry in general has seen a pretty rapid uptick in demand in the last couple of months. So I would say that we are rapidly transitioning to employment gains and recovery in these sectors that the data just aren't able to show yet. But I think over the next 4 to 6 to 8 weeks is really when it's going to start showing up in the data. But overall, when we look at the service sector, things have improved pretty dramatically in the last month or two.
All right. So you mentioned early on that South Carolina's recovery was faster than Georgia and North Carolina's. What data, if any, suggests to the reasons why that's the case?
So primarily there are at least two reasons. The first reason is because South Carolina had a policy where it had more targeted shutdowns and didn't shut down as extensively as other states. And that's especially relevant when comparing South Carolina to North Carolina. So that's part of it. But the other big part of it was due to our industry composition, where we just happen to be lucky or fortunate in that regard, because while we do have a significant leisure and hospitality sector, it is not it's not as concentrated in South Carolina as it is in many other states, and so that helped us out. When we're comparing ourselves to Georgia, remember that Georgia has a strong aerospace industry and airline sector as well. Delta, for example, is headquartered in Atlanta. So Georgia really was hurt a lot by leisure and hospitality. And so their industry composition just wasn't as favorable as South Carolina's. But when you so I would say the industry composition explains more of it when you compare South Carolina to Georgia. And it's more about the policy of the targeted shutdowns and the limited shutdowns, which is probably the main reason why we saw South Carolina fare better than North Carolina. So it's both of those reasons, but each state comparison is slightly different.
So what I hear you saying is that, in this case, it does matter where you operate your business.
Absolutely, yes, yes.
And
And South Carolina has been very fortunate, and we're also fortunate that all the competitive strengths that South Carolina had before the pandemic, we have them now too. And in many cases, we're even at more of an advantage going forward, because to the extent that working from home is the new normal, that means that more people are going to be able to locate anywhere they want in the US to live and work. And all of a sudden, South Carolina, as with a high quality of life, a low cost of living, a lot of natural amenities. I mean, there's a lot to love about South Carolina. And we can become even more competitive for those workers if we're proactive about it.
all right. All right. My last question. And will you go to the next slide, Dr.
Yeah,
Von?
sure. Yeah, this one here.
Yes. And so you touched on a point, a few questions ago, but what starkly different stands out on this graph to me is the size of the stimulus in comparison to the GDP, right? So in 2008, a negative 1,000, 700 billion in stimulus. And then in this period, at its trough, negative 2,000, and we're close to $3 trillion in stimulus.
Yes, if all this is spent, it completely overpowers that difference there. Yes.
So, so in my thinking, if things work like they have in the past, we should expect, and you've alluded to this, in the near term, I won't put a month or year on it, but in the nearer term, potentially a robust economy, just simply based on the stimulus packages that have come out.
Yes, I think there's so a couple comments on that. First of all, there's no question that we're going to see increased inflation beginning this summer, and we're already starting to see it. So that's going to happen. But again, inflation in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it does mean we're seeing more robust demand, and we're seeing already inflation in the services sector. So that's going to pick up, and we're going to see that continue as we move into the summer. But do we see this lasting inflation that is more long term? That's really where the unknown is. Where is this a blip, or does it turn into something more long lasting? And again, that's why there's a lot of debate about this, because we are in some uncharted waters. And the other factor here is that not all of these dollars, even though this is the size of the stimulus, that's not all necessarily going to be spent immediately. So depending on what the timing looks like, that's going to make a difference. And then also, how is the Fed likely to respond going forward? They're they're much more. The Fed in recent years has become much more activist, for lack of a better term. And they have done what you notice if you look at the economic expansions and the contractions over the last 30 plus years. What you find is that the average expansion has been growing in length over time. So each expansion tends to be longer than the previous one, and each recession tends to be shorter than the previous one. Mm-hmm. And that's because the Federal Reserve has been, they don't wait to act as much anymore. They are more activists. They are more interventionist. And again, there are positives and negatives associated with that. But one of the implications is that and Jay Powell has said this explicitly, that they're ready to act if they need to, if inflation begins to pick up. So they're aware of this potential challenge. The problem is that we don't want the Fed to have to interfere to reduce inflation, because that can create some real long-term problems. Because when you start to put the brakes on on a robust economy, that can very easily move us into a recession. So that's, again, the other concern. And then I think long term, as we think about the implications for long run debt for the US economy, I think we're going to hear more debate about that. And that may be a major political issue next year with all the spending happening this year in response to COVID. The questions come up about what does this imply for the long run? And again, it's too far out to say, but I would not be surprised if the concerns about debt and the economy is a central political issue in the election cycle next year.
Alan, excuse me, it is getting on 12:15, so I have a few questions that showed up directed to me. So I'm going to ask those now, if I could, please, Dr. Von Nessen.
Okay.
Let's see. You spoke a lot about the challenges of the leisure and hospitality industry. Which service-based businesses are showing strength and gains? And I believe you covered that. Also, an outlook of agriculture economy can help the farm input manufacturing industry big time, durable and consumables. That is evidently a statement.
Okay.
And then also, Michelle mentioned, Alan, that it's important to note that the funds, as in the shuttered venue and the restaurant revitalization, are limited to those are limited on those programs, especially the restaurant program. And many individuals and restaurants won't be able to take advantage. So that's everything I see on my side. So Alan, do you have your last slide, sir?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Carolyn. Let me see, share. Give me 1 minute and I'll move to it. So again, we want to thank Dr. Von Nessen for his great presentation, for all the actionable points that he provided to us. Also want to thank all attendees for showing up today. As a reminder, we will be sending out an email post-event survey, and all respondents who complete the survey will receive a copy of the slide deck. We have a few upcoming webinars that we want to make sure that you're aware of. In particular, for those who are on the coast, as disasters tend to hit you harder than those of us who are inland, particularly through this period of the year. On May 13th, one of our great business consultants, Martin Goodman, is going to be presenting when should business owners plan for disaster? And his statement is now, right? That's on May the 13th. And then the regional director, Paul Featheringgill, who's recently joined us, is having 2 seminars or webinars. The first on May the 20th, and it's titled, "Do You Maintain the Necessary Documents?" And this was birthed out of the challenges that we saw some small businesses having as we were helping them to take advantage of some of the stimulus funds that were put on the street. And then on the 27th of May, Paul again is going to walk you through how to apply for a business loan. And I believe William Furman with the SBA is going to be assisting with that webinar. To register for these and other webinars, you can go to www.scsbdc.com and /training events, and it will take you to our training event calendar. You can see these webinars and others. I want to thank you for your time today, and I look forward to seeing you in the future. As I always say, keep calm and small business on. Thank you, Dr. Von Nessen. Carolyn, turn it back over to you.
Thanks, everyone.